Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to continue to discuss, as we have in previous episodes as well, the coronavirus vaccine and how it is being distributed around the world. We've spoken about vaccine nationalism, etc. as well. Now there are concerns about one of the vaccines that's being produced, the AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine, because a number of countries, such as Thailand, Denmark, Norway, and I believe a few others as well, have so far suspended the use of that vaccine because there are fears that it may cause blood clots. Now, at the same time, we've also had another vaccine maker, Pfizer specifically, which has employed, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, high-level bullying against two Latin American countries during negotiations for them to acquire the vaccines, and has in fact demanded that they put up collateral for payments such as their federal bank reserves, embassy buildings, or military bases, even to guarantee against the legal costs of any potential adverse effects that people may face in the near future or after they've gotten those vaccines. So we're going to try to discuss just overall how vaccine makers and these pharmaceutical companies are acting around the world and whether or not concerns about these vaccines, such as blood clots and otherwise, are valid. To discuss that further, I'm joined by Dr. Robert Field, who is a professor of law and health management and policy at Drexel University. He's joining us this morning from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Robert, good morning, and thank you for joining us here in Scope today. Do you think the concerns about AstraZeneca are valid at this time?
I think it's too early to tell. These vaccines are all new. We don't have long-term data on them. There's a hint that there's a problem, but I think it's too early to know whether it's anything serious. Public health regulators have to weigh the balance between the possibility of a risk and the need to stop the virus as quickly as possible. And it's a question of how cautious they want to be. I think one major consideration is that if the side effect does turn out to be something serious, it could increase vaccine hesitancy, which could sabotage the entire effort to achieve global herd immunity.
That's what I wanted to ask you next, in fact, Robert, because obviously this does give credence to that argument. But then secondly, there's also the argument within that, those people who are hesitant to get the vaccine, that these vaccines were in some ways, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, sped up, right? The production of them are sped up. The research into them is sped up. Of course, I mean, all of them, from the best of our understanding from the outside, as a non-expert myself, there were trials and all of the above done. But nevertheless, these were produced a lot faster, from what I've understood, than previous vaccines have. Does that process, does that speeding up in and of itself then create the greater possibilities of danger for people?
It creates some more stronger possibilities. In particular, it creates more of a possibility with respect to long-term side effects. We have a few months of data on the clinical trials. We don't have the years of data that we might have with a full clinical trial. It's not entirely accurate to say that they were rushed. The mRNA technology, for instance, and the adenovirus technology of the J&J vaccine have been in the works for a decade or in some cases even more than that. So the groundwork has actually been building for years. But to test these actual vaccines, that has been rushed. And it's the same kind of cost-benefit analysis that public health officials always have to do. The need to fight the pandemic is so dire that it's acceptable to accept some level of risk. I think in the short term, we have a pretty good idea that there are no serious short-term effects except for this AstraZeneca blip. But we don't know about the long term, and there's nothing we can do about that if we want to fight the pandemic as quickly as possible.
If we may, then let's talk for a moment, if we can, about the Pfizer case and with Latin America, right? I don't want to go too much into specifics about that. There are a lot of details within the Bureau of Investigative Journalism report, but just as a whole, do you think that there has been, in some ways, when it comes to the more developing countries, an almost bullying type stance, possibly on the part of pharmaceutical companies? Of course, we're not all privy to the behind-the-scenes negotiations. So, I mean, at this point, we're just basing it on what's coming out, but there has seemingly been a divergence in approach on the part of pharmaceutical companies, be it towards the developed world versus the developing world?
Well, they've had a close relationship with the developed world since the beginning. We had the United States with Operation Warp Speed promoting some of the vaccines. We had advanced purchase commitments. The developing world is not able to afford those inducements and to create those bonds with the pharmaceutical companies. So from square one, the developing world was behind the developed world. We would have hoped that there would be more global coordination. A pandemic is global by nature. We've known the vaccines were in the works for a year now. I think that in the future, we need to look at much better coordination. After all, it's in the developed world's interest for the developing world to develop herd immunity. But I think it's entirely possible. I can't confirm the report about Pfizer bullying, but it's certainly possible that they have treated these countries differently. Remember, these are for-profit companies. They're not just in it for our health, they're in it for their bottom line. So if they think they can get a better deal, that's the way the market works.
Indeed, and that in fact leads me to my next point, because on the part of these companies, as you well know, as you just said there, they would say, listen, we've put in time, effort, and funds into this research, and a lot of that was taxpayer money from developed or developing countries, at least developed countries, pardon me. So, I mean, why should we be having these free handouts? I mean, it's not free, of course, but in the sense that freer handouts or cheaper handouts or quicker handouts, however we want to term it, to those other countries that did not have a part in paying for or researching these vaccines. But then on the other side, the argument is that, listen, if we're all not vaccinated, we're going to have more and more variants coming up. What are your thoughts about both sides of those arguments?
I think the real burden lies with the countries that funded the development of the vaccines. The U.S. Prime among them, but some of the Western European countries as well. They should have realized, and to some extent, I imagine they must have realized, that global distribution is in everyone's interest and ultimately the only solution to the pandemic. I think that it was incumbent upon these Western countries to make sure that the commitments that the manufacturers made were not just to their sponsors, but globally to eradicate the vaccine, the pandemic. And it appears that they have not done that.
So what do you think, somebody who is an expert in this field, what do you think will be the lessons that will be learned from this pandemic? I mean, we are, and we've always known, we've lived in a very unequal world, right? That's just been the reality for a very long time. Do you think that looking post coronavirus, that even when it comes to, I'm speaking specifically about global health policy, that there will be a greater effort to ensure that there is more equality? I mean, it would be, of course, hard to have across-the-board equality when it comes to health issues.
We would certainly hope so. And one of the lessons we've learned is that in preventing pandemics, global coordination is essential. We didn't have very good coordination this time, and we see the results. We don't have good global coordination on vaccine distribution, and it's certainly hurting the developing world and could end up coming back to hurt the developed world. That is a lesson. Whether we'll follow the lesson is another question. But clearly going forward, there will be more pandemics. And the only way to really stave them off is global coordination, to use whatever technologies we have for prevention and treatment, and to apply those to every country so that we don't have hotspots that are developing new pandemics. It is difficult for a developed country to go to its citizens and say, we helped develop this vaccine and we're going to divert it from you, our citizens, to another country that wasn't involved in developing it. I think countries like the U.S., leaders of countries like the U.S. are in somewhat of a tight spot in that respect. One thing that is encouraging that President Biden is talking about is sharing the technology so other countries can develop the vaccine on their own and not wait for Western manufacturing and then distribution. That will involve addressing some of the patent issues, the TRIPS Accord, which has to do with international patents, honoring international patents. But I think that's where it has to begin, is making sure that developing countries are not wholly dependent on the developed countries to not just create the vaccines, but to supply them. Maybe that's a lesson that we've learned.
Yeah, and that's a very good point to end this conversation on. We really appreciate you taking your time out, Robert, this Saturday morning to speak to us and to share your expertise with us about overall just vaccines and how they're being distributed, the lack of course, equal distribution, and then, of course, the issue of patents as well, which is increasingly becoming important so that countries are able to then independently produce those vaccines as well, to then be able to have as many people within their populations vaccinated, so that that again then is good for the developed world, because the more we have this vaccine, this pandemic and this virus circulating around the world, the more and more possibility there is for further variants to come up, for which these vaccines may not be completely prepared to deal with. Of course, we're going to keep a very close eye on that story, as this issue of vaccines and their distribution and the approach of pharmaceutical companies, for whom, of course, the bottom line is extremely important, that continues to be an issue which we will keep an eye on, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss once again Nigeria, and yet again there has been another abduction of students in Nigeria, this time in Kaduna State, the northwestern Kaduna State, that is. And this time girls were targeted and were abducted. This is the fourth mass school abduction in the country. What exactly is going wrong? We've discussed this, of course, before as well, about this sort of banditry, as the Nigerian government calls it, and the reasons behind it. We're going to put that to our guests who are joining us now from Nigeria. Joining us from Abuja is Abiola Temitope, who is a graduate researcher at the Institute of Peace and Strategic Studies, Nigeria. And joining us from Sango is Kehinde Titiloye, who is a postgraduate student of risk management at the University of Lagos. Kehinde and Abiola, thank you both for joining us today here in Scope. Kehinde, what are your thoughts about this fourth mass abduction? Why does this continue to happen?
Thank you very much, sir. I would say that it is very simple and straight. The elites in the north part of Nigeria and the political structure, their body language shows that they don't want to put an end to this banditry and continuous kidnapping by negotiating with this set of individuals that keep performing these illegal acts. And also, we must also put in note that the North has porous borders. Not only the North, like all third world of the world, to have porous borders in which it allows correlation of small light weapons.
Okay, we're going to go to Abiola. Abiola, what are your thoughts about why these abductions keep happening?
Thank you very much. From what my colleague there said, I would like to reiterate what he said. In Nigeria, you'd realize that there's border porosity, which has allowed proliferation of small arms and light weapons. And then when you look at the geography of the northern part of Nigeria, you'd realize that the geography itself has allowed the unending kidnapping and banditry in the northern part of Nigeria. And then when you look at this modus operandi of the bandits in Nigeria, it is quite similar to how Boko Haram started. So it brings the question that, okay, are we looking at an emergence of a new terrorist organization, or probably an asymmetry warfare again? Because if the recent kidnapping that happened in Kaduna, if we had 80 armed men, who was in charge? Who was the leader of these 80 armed men? Are we looking at another emergence of a new terrorist organization or terrorist group in Nigeria? Or are we looking at Boko Haram trying to work with local bandits this time around? So there are many things that we need to look at. And then the incentivization of bandits in Nigeria is another thing to look at, because when you keep on incentivizing bandits, then there's going to be proliferation of banditry. Recently, I think in 2019, the governor of Zamfara State engaged the bandits, and then he gave them money. After an agreement was reached between him and the bandits, they reneged on their promise, and then they went back into banditry. So you cannot keep on incentivizing banditry. Okay. And another thing to look at is the criminal justice system in Nigeria. The criminal justice system in Nigeria is jaundiced. It has problem, and it is lucid. It is very clear to say that any state where the criminal justice system is kwashiorkor, there's going to be a rise, and there's going to be proliferation of banditry, terrorism, insurgency in countries like that. So we need to look at the criminal justice system.
Sure. Okay. Abiola, if you allow me, I wanted to put the points that you just made there. Those are very good points. Kehinde, what are your thoughts about the Boko Haram aspect? Do you think that terrorists are involved in this sort of banditry? And secondly, do you also think that the criminal justice system needs to reform?
My perception of the criminal justice in Nigeria is very simple and straight. Like I said, that when we are discussing the current security challenges, especially being particular about the North, we have to look at some key concepts. We have to look at security. And when you talk about security, I'll break it down into three places. I'll talk about the management of security, operational security, and physical security. Currently, as we have it in the North now, we can only boast of physical security. Our operational security is currently poor, and the management of security is nothing to write home about. And you agree with me that as a citizen of a nation, you understand your environment, just like every other person who live in their own cities as well. The advent of Boko Haram, when they emerged, when they started terrorizing little neighboring towns, the body language of the elites, the security outfits then, they had excuses for bandits, people who are into illegal doings, people who are going against the law of the land. What do? They pat them in the back. They pay them off, just like Abiola has previously mentioned, that when they have done something wrong, they pay them off. They don't implement laws and order in these places. So this alone allowed the Boko Haram group. And when we had the Libya crisis, not to forget that after the outburst of Muammar Gaddafi, we had a lot of weapons that were flying around the borders of Africa. That is to say, to get a grenade, to get an AK-47, to get a pump action, you could get them at maybe 10% of the original prices. So this originally made so many of these bandits acquired weapons they don't even need, they never imagined they could get. And after one or two misconducts, they saw that it was very fruitful to get millions of naira, that's Nigerian currency, millions of naira for just kidnapping 20 people, then releasing them to the public. They now understand that they have a political power, and they understand that now they have a power, and the power we have given them is now we have accepted them as our watchdog and hunters. We are scared of them. The security outfit had remained in its own shell and refused to tackle this issue tactically. And you would agree with me that that is why the Boko Haram sect have always been making videos, they have been making pronouncements, have been challenging political classes, and even they have truncated the peace in the Northeast terribly, that people have been sacked from their own villages. These are pointers that we had this thing coming 8 years ago, but we didn't put an operational security in place. Where
all right, so if I may come in the Kehinde, because you made a good point there, and Abiola, I'm wondering, you know, regardless of the security situation and the reasons behind it, for the rest of the world looking from the outside in, at least, I mean, I would think that puts a lot of pressure on the Nigerian government too, right? I mean, this is, if we're completely honest, embarrassing, right? That the Nigerian security forces are not able to secure the most basic educational institutions and their own students.
Yeah, that's right. It's actually embarrassing. And it is quite alarming that the government, they've not really come out with any holistic approach to solve this problem. Because even if you look at the body language of the Nigerian government, it is not suggestive that they are really being proactive to these menace. recently the president came out to say anyone with AK-47 should be shot. And you just see that, okay, this might just be nominal because he might have come out to react in such way, but will action follow his word? So that's another thing to look at. It is quite understanding. It is quite logical to say that the political will in Nigeria is absent, because if you can really summon, you can come up with solutions to this problem, then the banditry, the kidnapping and all, it's not something that should be that should continue for a very long time. But the political will is absent there. Like the body language of the Nigerian government is also saying something different. Now we are having 4 kidnappings in less than 3-4 months, and then they are now attacking educational institutions, which means that this is another pattern that these terrorist groups are using, because Boko Haram is against education, and now that they are targeting schools. In Niger State now, for example, the governor of Niger State has asked that schools be closed for the indefinitely. So that means we are looking at a very, very big issue. Now, if education institutions are being closed, and then you are putting fear, you are putting apprehension in the minds of the people. People can no longer go on with their economic activities. Social activities are being stopped. Then we are looking at a bigger problem here. That was how Boko Haram started. And then we just looked at them. We felt, okay, it will end. But now we are seeing a bigger organization that's even gone beyond the Nigerian border. So that's what we are looking at. And then the governor of Kogi State mentioned something. Yeah. He said that during election, politicians, they employ bandits. But after the election, you fail to retrieve those arms and ammunition that you've given to them. So by the time election is over and then you've won the election, these people are left with the guns, they are left with the sophisticated ammunitions and all, and then you leave them. You do not employ them, or you do not continue to pay them. These people are left to fend for themselves, and the only way they can sustain their source of livelihood is to resort into criminalism. So if you are leaving them, you are not retrieving these weapons from them. So they go into the forest, and like I said, when we started, I said you have to look at the geography of the northern part of Nigeria. You look at forests, you look at places where you can hide. When you kidnap students, you can hide them, you can keep them for as long as you want.
Okay, so let's talk further, if we can, about the Nigerian people themselves. Kehinde, why aren't we seeing more anger on the part of Nigeria and the population itself? I mean, again, as I put to Abiola, if your children cannot be safe in schools, then what kind of confidence can one have, A, in the governing structure, be it Buhari or security forces? I mean, I would think that there should be a lot more uproar in the country.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. You would agree with me that late last year in Nigeria, we had a big movement, #End SARS. That was to end police brutality in Nigeria, because the police have a mindset of profiling. Once they see a young chap going on the streets and you are well dressed, or you use an Apple gadget, which is presumed to be expensive in this part of the world, you are being challenged, harassed, asked to transfer money to them. You can't go out with your laptops or your computers again. So where we have the problem is this, like Abiola has mentioned repeatedly, that we have the political will to stop insecurity in Nigeria is very poor. You will agree with me that from 2014, from the Chibok cases, where nearly 300 schoolgirls were kidnapped, we have had, including this one that happened in Kaduna now, we have had about 6 kidnaps, 6 different kidnaps, and the lowest set of people that have been kidnapped have been 27, and that was in Karanga late February this year. So you agree with me that if the North start closing schools down, this will lead to generational gap. That is to say, people in other parts of Nigeria, they'll be going to school, they continue with their schoolwork, and they get educated, they graduate from the system. But if the situation there gets worse and people don't want to go to school because they are scared of getting kidnapped or getting killed, it leads to a generational gap where that generation cannot match the generation here in the southwest. That's presumably the most developed side in Nigeria. Now, what does generational gap lead to? Generational gap only leads to another conflict as well. So it is imperative for the political will to go back to the drawing board, and we need to further scrutinize our security and draw out a new plan. The presidency, after so many criticisms, agreed to change the security chiefs, something it should have done 1 year ago. At every quarterly, every 3 months, we need a security review currently, because we are in a security crisis in the country. People are not guaranteed of their safety. I would like to quote the spokesman of the presidency. Late last year, some farmers were on their farm and they were killed. And Femi Adesina, the spokesman to the president, said that they did not get permission to go to their own farms. These are their ancestral lands. When people can no longer work on their own ancestral lands, people can no longer embark on their day-to-day activities, and they need...
Right. Okay, I think we're having some difficulties there with Kehinde's line once again, but we'll leave it there at that, because I think that's a good point to end it on as well. We appreciate, of course, Kehinde and Abiola for taking their time out of their Saturday schedules to speak to us here in Scope. Both of them describing really the security challenges that Nigeria faces. The fact that we keep having these sorts of abductions taking place. I mean, there are reports of minor abductions taking place all the time. As Kehinde there was describing, you can't even walk around with nice devices, for example, in your hand, a smart device or otherwise, or even good clothes on. I mean, you will be abducted and or robbed. And in this situation, there doesn't seem to be political will, as Abiola had also mentioned, on the part of the government and or security forces. I mean, of course, they're paying lip service to the fact that their own citizens are in constant danger, but something really is going wrong here. And it seems that there isn't anyone on top, at least, who's ready to deal with this properly. Be it Boko Haram, be it just banditry for the sake of the fact that, as both of our guests are mentioned, there are arms in the hands of people who are unemployed and then will use that to be able to try to make some money for their own respective families. This situation badly needs a resolution, be it on the part of external players' involvement or internal discussions. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. Now, in this last segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the UK, and there's been essentially a tell-all on part of the Wired magazine online, speaking about how for the last 2 years, police, as well as internet companies in the UK, have been secretly building and testing surveillance technology that could log and store the web browsing of every single person in the UK. Now, of course, the privacy/surveillance concerns are fairly obvious when you have that widespread sort of surveillance and infiltration, if I may call it that, into everyone's private communications, surfing, et cetera, on the internet. What does this then mean going forward? Civil liberties organizations obviously arguing against this sort of legislation, as well as any such initiative, if it were to be completely confirmed and brought forth and used, which it may very well already be, but we don't know that for sure, of course, at this point in time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Mike Nellis, who is an emeritus professor of criminal and community justice at the Center for Law, Crime and Justice at the University of Strathclyde. He's joining us today from Glasgow in Scotland. Mike, thank you very much for taking your time out. How concerning is this report? I mean, why would the government, as well as internet companies, work together, in fact, to have the web browsing of every single Briton open to them?
Well, the question of how concerning it is very interesting, because I wouldn't say at the moment that outside of the civil liberties groups that are, understandably preoccupied with this has actually made the mainstream news. I don't think that Britain is having a big conversation about the new elements of the Investigatory Powers Act. And I think the reason for that is that we have seen a number of gradual changes since the 1990s, which have habituated the public to these developments. And it's unfortunate, in a sense, that they don't pay quite as much broader attention to this as the pressure groups like Liberty, Privacy International, Big Brother Watch, Open Rights Organization, they're very preoccupied with it and they're on the case. But as a public issue, I'm not sure it exists very strongly, to be honest with you.
The argument, I apologize for cutting you off, but the argument, as I'm sure you've heard many, many times yourself, as somebody who works in this field, is that if you have nothing to hide, what are you worried about? How do you respond to that?
Well, I think the idea that you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear is nonsense. I mean, you cannot defend mass surveillance in those terms. It's just nonsense. We've all got things to hide. We all have a right to privacy. We all have some degree of a right to secrecy. That should be normal and ordinary in a democracy. Now, it's made more difficult to sustain because there will always be people who will use privacy and secrecy malevolently. So it's not that there's no issue about the need to monitor or the need to surveil in some instances, but the scale of it and the bulk data that it is now possible to collect makes a mockery of the idea that we have a right to preserve the privacy and secrecy that we would once have considered perfectly normal. You can't defend bulk surveillance with the idea that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. There's a lot to fear from the amount of data that can be extracted from us, processed and transferred between agencies. Even things can go wrong. One doesn't have to assume that there is going to be malevolent intent, but there could be malevolent intent on all sorts of democratic formations if the government of the day has access quite asymmetrically to a massive amount of data that you don't know is held on you and that you don't know how it might be used against you.
It's not like this is just limited to the UK, right, Mike? I mean, we have, if I may just take a more global outlook just for a moment, because these all then create precedents, right, for other countries then to emulate, especially, of course, allied countries to the UK. So, for example, we currently have in Australia a surveillance bill, which is also concerning for human rights groups there and civil liberties groups there. And even, after 9/11, if we're completely honest, many of the powers that were given to the presidency and respective agencies within the US have also had many forms of surveillance overreach. Is this then just the reality that all of us are going to live with? I mean, as much as we may argue against it and fight it, is this just, I mean, I'm speaking realistically or not ideally, but do you think realistically this is just the way things are headed?
Realistically, this is indeed where things are heading. This is the 21st century. You're quite right that the United Kingdom is by no means alone in wrestling with these issues. It's probably fair to say that the United Kingdom has been more to the fore in the development of surveillance technologies than has been recognised. When Edward Snowden made his revelations back in 2013 and 14, everybody was looking to the United States like they were doing something unique. But apart from the fact that they were doing it in partnership with the UK anyway, they were far from unique. We know that Israel does lots of bulk surveillance. We know that Germany can do lots of bulk surveillance. This is the 21st century, and all countries are wrestling with these issues to some degree. And it's not nothing. It is complicated. There are new threats. There are real threats. Cybersecurity is a threat. Terrorism is a threat. The danger, I suppose, from a human rights and civil libertarian point of view, is that these threats are exaggerated and amplified and magnified by government in order to justify more intrusive levels of control over their own populations. In democracies, we don't trust governments fully. We want transparency. We want to hold them to account. So although we can realistically acknowledge that there are real threats and dangers and things that the public need to be protected from, that doesn't take us away from the need to be clear about how far the government is going in the name of protecting us from these dangers.
So as you had correctly pointed out earlier, Mike, there isn't much talk of this in the mainstream. And, I looked beyond the Wired article. I mean, I did find the story on another website, but again, it wasn't necessarily quote unquote mainstream media as such within the UK. Why do you think that is, that this hasn't yet hit the radars? Is it just that people are all distracted with, the pandemic, of course, and then, the Brexit and all the other contexts that the country is going through? Or is it just that people sort of are desensitized to it?
My view of that at the moment would be that it is the distraction of the pandemic and Brexit, both of which have got implications for privacy and data collection and data extraction. We are refracting the endemic concerns we have about technology, privacy and data protection. When they arise, they are arising in the context of Brexit and the data transmission between Europe and the United Kingdom, and also the privacy concerns about health surveillance that the pandemic is generating. It usually takes some kind of scandal or exposure or some kind of loss of data by a government agency to bring these issues to the fore in Britain. I think that just historically, at the time of the Snowden investigations, it was said at the time that there wasn't a very massive reaction in Britain to the Snowden revelations. I mean, the Guardian newspaper played a leading part in exposing it. So a section of the liberal left was concerned about it. But there seems to be a kind of attitude in Britain that says spying's okay. Hey, James Bond was a spy. We kind of revere spies. We think that it's a necessary and glamorous thing to do. And of course, GCHQ, our signals and intelligence operation, in some respects, the roots of that lay in the work that Alan Turing did during the Second World War to decrypt German coding, to decrypt German signals intelligence. And we have an unduly positive view about some of the things that governments can do in respect of surveillance now, because we celebrate the wisdom with which they did these things in the past. And that's probably a dangerous attitude to have, actually.
And I wonder, what happens next then? Because I also think that, I would think that in many people's minds, of course, whenever this does come out completely into the open in a transparent fashion, that this may not look very good. And I'm talking more politically now about the conservative government currently in place. But do you think that there's sort of broad agreement within the establishment as a whole that this needs to happen? I mean, is this not a conservative versus a Labour issue? Is this more just across the board that, hey, we all agree upon this? I mean, I know that's a heavy duty question, which again, we don't know what happens behind the scenes, but do you think there's much difference between who's really in power on this issue?
Yes, I mean, it's a good question, and it's hard to know. I think that the Labour Party at the present moment in time has got other concerns, and to the best of my knowledge, it has not made any significant statements about this for a long time, not just in relation to the specific issue that you're raising with me this morning, but about the Investigatory Powers Act in general. My sense is that there is a consistent and stable attitude in the establishment, as you call it, towards the necessity and inevitability of doing these things. Our security agencies are much more open than they used to be. We know the names of the heads of the agencies. They make press releases. They tell us about some of what they are going to do in the name of transparency and legitimacy. But whether they're telling you all the important things that they are doing or going as far as they should to explain openly what they are doing is an open question. Yeah. I mean, just last week, GCHQ told us that it was going to start using a more elaborate artificial intelligence platform to sift data. And the capabilities of artificial intelligence now are clearly a driver in the raising of the stakes about surveillance. We are going to be capable of doing bulk surveillance on a scale that we weren't able to do maybe even at the time of the Snowden revelations because of artificial intelligence. And that just makes human rights, civil libertarian initiatives that take place in a jurisdiction like the UK, it makes their work a little bit harder when you know that there are these external drivers on the issues that the UK government feels that it is facing.
We'll have to leave there as a final word, but we sincerely appreciate you taking our time out of your busy schedule this Saturday to share your expertise with us. That was a really interesting conversation. That was Mike Nellis speaking to us here from Glasgow in Scotland. We're speaking there about the fact that for the past 2 years, we've had police security services in the UK, as well as internet companies themselves, those very companies who probably would tell us that, hey, your privacy matters to us. We don't want to sell your data to anybody. They're actually working in tandem to produce legislation and technology that could, in fact, log and store all information, web browsing information, that is, of every single person in the UK. And this is not, as we discussed there, unique to the UK. This is possibly going to happen in Australia, probably has already started happening or has already happened in the United States ever since, especially the 9/11 attacks. So in these years, they're probably possibly perfected that art. And there is a lack of transparency here. I mean, there isn't discussion about this in the mainstream media right now, at least on this issue of the UK. And probably by the time it comes out, it may very well be too late to then put this back into the box. Once this Pandora's box has been opened, we don't know, of course, but we hope that at some point in time, the citizenry will wake up and will demand better from their respective governments, even if the goal really is to keep them secure. This certainly seems to be a significant overreach into every single person's right to privacy. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.